It begins so quietly that most people would miss it. The way history sometimes slips into the room like a faint breeze, you only notice once it's already brushing past your face. Rome was loud, bustling, crowded, and restless, but tucked inside that noise was a small corner where everything felt strangely still. A place where the city's heartbeat slowed down, where laws and rituals carried the weight of centuries, and where a group of young girls lived lives so unusual, so strict, and so mysterious that even the Romans treated them with a mix of awe and fear. These were the Vestal Virgins, guardians of an eternal flame, protectors of Rome's spiritual safety, and symbols of purity in a world that rarely slowed down long enough to care about such things. But this story doesn't start with power or prestige. It starts with a single girl, a girl who never asked for any of it. Her name is lost to time, like so many people swallowed by history. But it doesn't matter, because every Vestal story began almost the same way. A quiet morning, a father gripping his daughter's hand a little too tightly, a priest looking for a face that fit the rules, and a destiny that could not be refused. Picture her walking through the busy Roman streets, not quite understanding why strangers step aside when they see her, why the guards part the crowds so her small feet don't have to touch the rough stones. She's about 6 or 7 years old, younger than the age most children today start school. But her life is about to be reshaped by an ancient tradition older than memory, older than the Republic, older even than the myths Rome told about itself. The keyword Vestal Virgins sounds almost gentle now, like something you'd whisper before drifting off to sleep. But in Rome, it carried an unimaginable weight. The Romans believed that the entire survival of the city, its walls, its armies, its families, its future, depended on the sacred fire they kept burning. If the flame ever died, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a sign that the gods had turned their backs on Rome, and that was the burden placed on these girls. But in the moment our story begins, she doesn't know anything about sacred flames or prophecies or what it means to give up 12 years of childhood for service, and another 20 for a life shaped around rules stricter than anything we know today. She doesn't know about the long robes, or the quiet rooms, or the centuries of pressure waiting to settle on her shoulders like dust from a forgotten age. She only hears footsteps echoing in the marble hallways as they approach the temple for the first time. Her father walks beside her, but not too close. Even he knows that once she crosses the threshold, she will no longer be his. She'll belong to Rome, to the goddess Vesta, to the flame that must always stay lit. It's strange how a society can take a child and turn her into a symbol, but Rome did it so confidently that the people barely questioned it. The temple itself isn't huge or extravagant like the buildings that tourists picture when they imagine ancient Rome. It's simple, round, quiet, a place where noise feels inappropriate, even from the distant markets and shouting vendors outside. The air inside smells faintly of smoke, warm and sweet, as if the fire is breathing. And in a way, the Romans believed it was. They believed it lived. The girl looks up at it, not understanding why everyone in the room seems to hold their breath the moment she steps toward the flame. She doesn't feel sacred. She doesn't feel powerful. She feels like a child who still sleeps with a hand tucked under her cheek, like someone who just wants to go back home and hear familiar voices again. But those voices fade behind her as the ceremony begins. The priest stands tall, draped in white, his face calm but unreadable. His voice echoes through the hall, soft but firm, as he calls her forward. There's something ceremonial about every movement, every word, as if the temple itself is watching. And maybe it is. Rome didn't just believe in gods. They lived among them in every stone, every law, every ritual. When the priest places his hand on the girl's head, Rome believes it's Vesta herself choosing her. The vow is spoken. The audience falls silent, and the girl becomes something else entirely. A Vestal Virgin. Outside the temple, Rome keeps moving. Markets bargaining, chariots clattering, seas of people going about their day. But inside these walls, time slows. For the next 30 years, she will wake and sleep to the rhythm of rituals. She will guard the eternal flame. She will fetch water from a sacred spring, prepare offerings, learn traditions older than language, and live in a world where mistakes carry consequences too heavy for any child, especially if that sacred flame goes out. That is the part no one ever tells gently. If the flame died under her watch, the punishment could be severe. The Romans believed the flame's survival was tied to the city's safety. To fail was not just a mistake, it was a spiritual danger. And if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the consequences were even harsher, woven with fear and superstition. The stories whispered about such punishments were heavy, unsettling, and enough to make even grown men look away. Yet, strangely, Vestal Virgins were also some of the most powerful women in Rome. They could own property. They could ride in carriages. They could free prisoners with a touch. Their word was trusted above almost anyone else's. Important men who ruled Rome respected them deeply, sometimes even feared them a little. They lived in a sanctuary that few dared to enter without invitation. But power is not always freedom, and respect is not always kindness. In the evenings, when the city dimmed and torches cast long shadows across the courtyard, the girl might sit quietly with older Vestals who had long grown used to their strange existence. Their robes whispered across the stone floors as they walked, their expressions composed, their lives wrapped tightly in ritual and order. They tried to comfort her, to teach her, to help her understand what it meant to be chosen. But deep down, each of them had once been that same frightened child. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, she would begin to settle into the rhythm. The quiet mornings, the soft crackling of the flame, the distant echoes of life continuing outside the temple walls, a life she could never again fully join. Rome would grow and change, but within this sacred circle, things stayed the same, as if sealed away from time itself. And perhaps that's the strangest part of this whole story. The Vestal Virgins lived in the center of the busiest, most powerful city in the ancient world. Yet their lives were almost dreamlike, slow, controlled, like a separate world hidden inside the larger one. They were symbols of purity, but they were also human beings with fears, hopes, routines, and quiet moments that history often forgets to mention. Sometimes, late at night, when the temple was dim and the flame glowed softly like a heartbeat, she might close her eyes and try to remember the sound of her mother's voice or the warmth of her old home. She didn't regret being chosen. She barely understood what regret was, but she felt something else. Something like a longing for a life she had stepped out of too soon. And yet, there was something comforting in this strange, silent world too. Something peaceful about the way the flame flickered in the dark, steady and alive. Something calming about the routine, the simple tasks, the gentle warmth of tradition. Her life wasn't loud or full of excitement, but it had purpose. It had meaning. Still, beneath that calm surface, something else was always there. A quiet question, a quiet fear. What if the flame went out? What if Rome saw it as a sign? What if the goddess Vesta felt displeased? And what would it mean for the temple, for the Vestals, for her? The older priestesses tried not to speak of such things too often, but every once in a while, when the night was long and the sky outside the temple turned dark purple, the stories slipped through their voices. Stories of disasters, stories of omens, stories of years when the flame burned weaker than usual, and the city trembled with worry. And those stories matter now, because one particular year, one that would become whispered through generations, was approaching. A year when Rome would be shaken by rumors, shadows, and something unexplained. A year when the flame itself would seem to flicker in ways no one could understand. And our young Vestal, still new, still learning, still carrying the weight of expectations she never asked for, would find herself standing right in the center of it. But that part comes later. For now, the temple is quiet. The flame is steady. The girl is safe. Or at least, it seems that way. Because something is beginning to shift in Rome. Slowly, quietly, like the first stir of a breeze before a storm. And when the change arrives, it will test everything the Vestals have ever believed. Everything Rome depended on. Everything this young girl thought she knew. And whether the flame survives, well, that is where the real story begins. Just as the night deepens and the shadows inside the temple stretch a little farther, the flame gives a small, unusual flicker, one that none of the Vestals notice yet. Not yet, but soon they will. And when they do, nothing in Rome will feel quite as steady again. The strange flicker faded as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed back into the gentle movement of the flame as if it had never happened at all. The young Vestal didn't notice it, not because she wasn't paying attention, but because her mind was busy with the small task she'd been trusted with that evening. Carefully folding cloths, sweeping the floor where petals from an earlier offering had drifted, checking the small bowl of water near the altar, making sure it was filled just enough but not too much. Tiny things that gave her comfort, even when she didn't fully understand the deeper meaning behind them. One of the older Vestals, Licinia, watched her quietly from across the room. Licinia was calm in a way that didn't come naturally to most people. She had a gentle face, soft brown eyes, and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. When the girl had arrived months earlier, frightened and unsure, Licinia had been the one who knelt beside her and said, "You'll be all right here. We all were once you." Every time she remembered those words, the girl felt a little less alone. Tonight, Licinia approached her with that same slow, quiet grace. "You're doing well," she said softly. "The temple feels peaceful when you're here." The girl didn't know how to respond. She only looked up with shy eyes and nodded. Compliments made her nervous. She wasn't used to praise, especially praise that felt so heavy with meaning. Licinia smiled at her, as if she understood exactly what she was feeling. Outside, a distant rumble of carts rolled across the stones, but inside the temple the silence felt almost thick, like it wrapped itself gently around the walls. Rome could be chaotic, but this place carried its own rhythm, its own pulse. A slow one, a steady one. "You should rest," Licinia whispered. "You've worked enough for today." But before the girl could answer, footsteps echoed from the entrance. They weren't loud or hurried, just deliberate, the kind of footsteps a person makes when they know they are entering a sacred place. The other Vestals lifted their heads, and the girl did too, trying to see who was arriving so late. A priest stepped inside, his robe almost brushing the ground. His expression was calm, but his eyes showed something else. Not fear, exactly, but a concern that was carefully held back, the way adults hide their worries from children. He approached Licinia first. "The Pontifex Maximus wants to speak with all of you at dawn," he said quietly. "He has received reports." Licinia frowned slightly. "What kind of reports?" The priest hesitated. "Omens," he said simply, "and whispers about disturbances around the forum." Omens. In Rome, that word could mean almost anything: a strange bird in the wrong place, an unexpected dream, a sudden shift in the wind. But people took them seriously, especially when the city felt uneasy. And lately, Rome had felt different. There had been a few odd stories circulating in the markets, strange noises at night, unusual patterns in the clouds, the behavior of animals shifting for reasons no one could explain. Most of it was probably imagination or coincidence, but Romans weren't a people who ignored signs, especially not ones that seemed to build on each other. The girl didn't fully understand what an omen was yet, but she could feel the tension in the room. Even the flame seemed to burn with a deeper hum, though maybe that was just her imagination. Licinia nodded to the priest. "We'll be ready." The priest bowed slightly and backed away before turning to leave. As he exited the temple, the door closed behind him with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have been. The girl clutched the cloth she had been folding. "Are we in trouble?" she asked quietly. Licinia shook her head. "Not trouble. Not yet. But when the Pontifex calls a meeting, it means something is changing. We're about to." Another older Vestal, Marcia, joined them. Marcia was different from Licinia, sharper, more serious, with a gaze that missed nothing. "We need to stay alert tonight," she said. "Just in case." "In case of what?" the girl whispered. Marcia softened, only a little. "The flame tells us things sometimes, not always in ways we understand." The girl looked toward the sacred hearth. It looked the same as always, warm, steady, alive, but suddenly she wondered if it had secrets she couldn't see, if it could sense things long before people did. The hours passed slowly. The night deepened. The Vestals took turns keeping watch, though none of them admitted that was what they were doing. It felt strange to the girl, being awake in a place so still, listening to the fire hum quietly while the city outside seemed to drift further and further away. Around midnight, Licinia sat beside her on a stone bench. "Try to sleep a little," she said gently. "I'm not tired," the girl whispered, though that wasn't entirely true. "Then just close your eyes," Licinia said. "Not to sleep, just to rest." The girl did as she was told, letting her eyes fall shut. She breathed slowly, listening to the crackling of the flame. For a moment, everything felt calm again, almost peaceful. And then, there it was. A second flicker. This one was stronger. The girl's eyes snapped open just in time to see the flame lean sharply to one side, as if pushed by a sudden breath of air. Except there was no wind. The temple was closed, sealed against the night. The air was still. Licinia noticed it too. She sat up straighter, her hands tightening around the edge of the bench. The flame wavered again, not dangerously, but strangely, like it was reacting to something unseen. Marcia appeared from the shadows, drawn by the movement. She stepped close to the hearth, her face lit in warm gold. "It's not natural," she murmured. "Should we wake the others?" Licinia asked. "Not yet." Marcia reached a hand near the flame, not touching it, just feeling the air around it. "Something is shifting, but it's not weakening. It's responding." "Responding to what?" the girl whispered. Neither woman answered. The flames settled again, as if nothing had happened. Marcia watched it for a long moment before turning away. "Keep your eyes open," she said. "Tonight feels wrong." But the girl didn't need to be told. Her heart was already beating faster. She felt something too, a quiet unease she didn't have words for. Still, after a while, the night grew calm again. The flame burned steadily. The Vestals drifted back into their soft night routines. Licinia hummed a small tune under her breath, an old melody she said her mother used to sing. It filled the silence gently, like warm water spreading through a cold room. But even music couldn't keep the tension away entirely, because Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. The city outside was unusually still. No late-night shouts, no clattering wheels, no restless animals. It was as if the whole world had paused, waiting for something. And just before dawn, when the temple was at its quietest and the sky outside was a soft, early gray, the girl heard it. A sound, not loud, not sharp, just a soft, distant shift, like stone moving under pressure, like something old waking up. She looked at the flame. It flickered again. Only this time, it didn't stop. It leaned. It stretched. It began to sway like a living thing trying to speak. Licinia gasped softly. Marcia stood up, so fast her robe whispered across the floor. Because this wasn't normal. This wasn't an omen they recognized. This was something else. Something Rome wasn't prepared for. In the moment the temple doors swung open, far earlier than dawn prayers should have begun, the girl knew the day ahead would change everything. The heavy wooden doors didn't slam open. They didn't crack or splinter the way doors do in dramatic stories. They simply drifted inward with a slow, steady movement that felt almost too controlled, as if someone had pushed them with careful hands. But when the Vestals turned toward the entrance, there was no one standing there. No priest, no guard, no servant arriving early. Only the pale gray light of Rome's earliest morning stretching across the steps like a thin sheet of mist. The girl's breath caught in her throat. Licinia rose to her feet, calm but alert, and Marcia took a single step forward, her eyes narrowing as she searched the shadows beyond the threshold. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. For a moment it felt as if even the birds had chosen to wait. "Did someone enter?" the girl whispered. "No," Marcia said softly. "Or if they did, they left no trace." The words felt too big for the quiet temple, like they didn't belong in this sheltered world. The sacred flame behind them leaned slightly again, the same gentle sway that had started the night's unsettling chain of events. It bothered her, and she could tell it bothered the others too, but no one spoke about fear out loud. The Vestals weren't supposed to fear things. They were the calm center of Rome, the guardians of stability. But calm was harder to hold on to when the flame started behaving like it had its own thoughts. A soft rustle came from outside, barely more than the movement of fabric. The girl's body tensed. Licinia placed a hand in front of her, a protective gesture so small and natural that the girl barely noticed how much it steadied her. A guard finally appeared at the steps, yawning as if he'd only just woken up. He blinked in confusion at the open doors. "Did someone call for me?" he asked. Marcia shook her head. No one touched the doors. The guard frowned. "They were closed when I passed a few moments ago." Licinia exchanged a look with Marcia, one of those quiet, experienced looks that said everything without speaking. Something was wrong, something they didn't yet understand. But they couldn't cause panic, not before dawn, not before the Pontifex arrived to explain the ominous meeting that had been called. As Licinia stepped forward to close the doors again, the girl felt the flame pulse behind her. Not loudly, not violently, just a slight surge of warmth, almost like breath on the back of her neck. She turned slowly, watching the fire return to its steady rhythm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had reacted to something outside, or to the opening of the doors, or perhaps to whatever had caused them to open in the first place. She told herself it was just nerves, just imagination, just the pressure of a long night with too little sleep. But imagination didn't make fire bend toward doorways, and nerves didn't open temple doors on their own. When the doors closed again, Licinia returned to the hearth. Her face was calm, but there was tension hidden in the small lines near her eyes. "We'll wait together until dawn," she said gently. "No one leaves. No one enters. The Pontifex Maximus will explain the rest." The girl nodded, but her mind was restless. She wanted to ask questions, dozens of them, but she didn't want to sound foolish. She was the youngest here. She didn't fully understand her role yet. She only knew pieces of it. They tended the flame, they performed rituals, they represented purity and stability in the eyes of Rome. People respected them, feared disappointing them, believed the city would fall if the flame ever went out. But no one had told her what to do when the flame behaved like a living creature. As the minutes slipped by, the other Vestals drifted in from their quarters, unaware of the night's strange events. They looked sleepy, relaxed, still wrapped in the softness of early morning. But when they saw Licinia and Marcia standing alert beside the hearth, they straightened instantly. "What happened?" one of them whispered. "Nothing we can explain yet," Licinia said. "The Pontifex will come soon." The girl felt all their eyes turn toward the sacred fire. Even the ones who didn't know the details could sense something different about the room, a strange pressure in the air, a feeling like being watched by something gentle but ancient, something that had existed long before the city itself. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, the temple filled with that soft gray glow Romans knew well, the color of marble at daybreak, the color of stone that had seen centuries of footsteps. And with that light came a sense of movement in the city beyond the steps. People beginning to wake, vendors preparing for a long day of selling, farmers bringing in produce, travelers arriving at the gates. Normal life was resuming, but Rome did not feel normal. Not this morning. A low murmur floated in through the cracks around the door. Voices, footsteps, the growing hum of a city that didn't know something was wrong at its heart. The Vestals stood together near the flame, forming a quiet ring around it, each one silently watching the doorway. Finally, footsteps approached. Solid ones, confident ones, the kind that belonged to someone with authority. The Pontifex Maximus appeared in the doorway, his robe brushed with pale morning light. His face was calm, but there was a heaviness in his expression, a weight that came from sleepless hours and troubling thoughts. Behind him stood two priests, carrying scrolls and small wooden containers sealed with wax. He stepped inside without speaking, and all the Vestals bowed their heads in respect. He paused near the hearth, staring at the flame for a long moment, as if he could read something within it that the others could not. Then he finally turned to face them. "There have been signs," he said quietly. "Several. Over many nights." The girl felt a chill run along her arms. The Pontifex continued, birds behaving strangely, water patterns shifting, reports of tremors beneath the forum. And last night, the augurs observed a celestial irregularity. A few of the older Vestals exchanged uneasy glances. The Pontifex lowered his voice. These things alone may mean nothing, but together, they suggest Rome is entering a moment of uncertainty. The word uncertainty hung in the air like smoke. He approached the hearth and studied the flame again. I have been told the fire behaved strangely in the night. Licinia nodded. Twice. It leaned without wind. And once it pulsed. Pulsed, he repeated. Marcia stepped forward, like it was reacting to something. The Pontifex did not dismiss this. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if a thought he had tried to avoid was now unavoidable. It may be connected to the omens, he said, or maybe something else entirely. But we must be cautious. Rome watches this flame. Rome depends on it. The girl felt her heart tighten, not because she feared the work, she didn't, but because the Pontifex spoke with the tone of someone preparing for the possibility of disaster. And the flame had been her responsibility tonight. What do we do? Licinia asked softly. For now, observe. The Pontifex gestured to the priests behind him, who unsealed the wooden containers. Inside were small bronze instruments, each one carved with delicate markings. We will measure the air, the temperature, the vibration of the stones. This temple is old. It listens before it speaks. The girl didn't understand any of the instruments, but she understood the seriousness. The priests moved through the space with careful steps, placing tools in specific locations, writing down details on wax tablets. One paused near the doorway and frowned slightly, tracing the edges of the frame. He whispered something to the Pontifex. The Pontifex's expression tightened. He turned back to the Vestals. Has anyone touched the door since last night? Licinia shook her head. They opened on their own. The Pontifex closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing this. When he opened them again, his gaze settled on the girl, not unkindly, but deeply, as though he sensed something about her. You were tending the flame? She nodded, throat dry. Did you feel anything unusual? She tried to find words. Tried to name what she had felt. The warmth like breath, the shifting scents in the air, the quiet wrongness. But the words came out small. It felt alive, she whispered. The room went still. Not a dramatic silence, just that soft, dense quiet of people who were suddenly listening much more closely. The Pontifex studied her for several long seconds before stepping back toward the flame. He looked at it the same way a historian might look at an ancient inscription, reading meaning in every flicker, every movement. Outside, Rome was fully awake now. Voices, footsteps, distant horns, the rumbling of carts. Life was moving forward with its usual rhythm. But inside the temple, time felt slow and heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting. The Pontifex finally spoke again. We will not alarm the city, he said quietly. We will not even tell the Senate. For now, this stays within these walls. The older Vestals nodded with solemn understanding. The girl felt her heart sink. Secrets never meant good things. The Pontifex added, but you must observe everything. No flicker is too small. No sound is meaningless. The flame may be responding to something we have not yet seen. He turned toward the door as if preparing to leave, but then paused. And what he said next made every Vestal straighten in silent fear. There is one more omen, he said, reported last night from a traveler at the city gates. He looked at the girl again, almost apologetically. He claimed he saw a shadow in the sky. Not a bird, not a cloud. Something he did not have words for. A quiet shiver passed through the room. Before anyone could speak, the flame behind them flickered again. Once, twice, then leaned sharply toward the doorway, as if answering something none of them could see. The flame steadied again, but the air didn't. It seemed to stretch thinner, almost like the space inside the temple had shifted without anyone moving. The girl felt at first a slight pressure in her ears, like the beginning of a storm far out at sea. Marcia turned slowly, as if she sensed it too, and Licinia's eyes darted toward the doorway, alert and worried. The Pontifex Maximus didn't speak for several breaths. His gaze rested on the flame, but he wasn't watching it anymore. He was listening, not to the crackle of fire, but to the silence around it. He looked as if he was trying to catch the faintest sound, the faintest hint of something that didn't belong. Finally, he spoke with a calm that felt too practiced. Remain inside today, all of you. No visits to the forum, no errands, no ceremonies. Until we know more, the temple must stay closed. The older Vestals nodded in agreement, but the younger ones exchanged uneasy glances. They had never known a day when the doors were shut to the public. People came here for blessings, for comfort, for small rituals that made them feel Rome was watched over. Closing the temple would be noticed. The pontifex continued. I'll send word to the Senate that we are conducting a private purification ritual. It will be believable. The people will accept it. He was already turning to leave, but the girl saw his hand tremble slightly as he pulled his robe straight. Just a moment, just a faint tremor, but enough to show that even he, a man who had lived decades in sacred duty, felt the weight of what was happening. When the doors shut behind him and the priests, the temple grew still again. The city noise outside returned to its usual rhythm, but somehow it felt distant, muffled, as if the marble walls were thickening against the world. Marcia placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. You did well, she said softly. You spoke the truth. The girl nodded, though doubt still nagged at the back of her mind. What if speaking the truth only made things more dangerous? What if it put attention on her she didn't want? But deep down, she knew she couldn't have lied. Not about the fire, not about the way it had reacted. Something in it had felt intentional. As the Vestals settled into small tasks, sweeping ashes, adjusting lamps, preparing the morning offerings, the girl found her thoughts drifting to the pontifex's final words. The traveler's report, the shadow in the sky, something with no name. Rome had seen storms, eclipses, flocks of birds flying strangely. But a shadow that wasn't a creature? That unsettled her more than anything else. She tried to return her mind to her duties. That was what she had been taught. Let the ritual steady you. Let the sacred tasks bring focus when the world felt uncertain. But every time she passed the hearth, she felt as if the flame tilted slightly toward her. Not much, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel heat brushing her arm like a whispered greeting or a warning. By midday, the temple felt warmer than usual. Not hot, just charged. The kind of warmth that made your skin sensitive, made each sound sharper, each breath more aware. Some of the older Vestals had retreated to quieter corners, whispering among themselves. Marcia remained near the hearth, calm as always, but her posture was stiffer than usual. The girl approached Licinia, who was sorting herbs for afternoon purification rituals. Do you think, the girl began quietly, that the flame has ever acted like this before? Licinia didn't answer right away. She crushed a sprig of laurel between her fingers, breathing in the scent as if grounding herself. Only then did she look up. There are old stories, she said in a low tone. Not many, not written down, just spoken from one Vestal to another. Stories about times when the flame behaved strangely. The girl's pulse quickened. What kind of stories? Licinia hesitated. There was a record once, long ago, of a flame that folded inward on itself the night before a great fire swept through the city. Another time, it is said to have risen in a tall column the day before a military loss. The girl swallowed hard. So it warns us? Licinia shook her head. Not warns. Reflects. The flame reacts to the heart of Rome. When the city trembles, the fire trembles. When the people grow afraid, it shifts. She paused. But once or twice in our history, it moved in ways no one understood. The girl waited, hardly daring to breathe. In those times, Licinia continued, the flame wasn't reacting to Rome. It was reacting to something else. Something else. The words lingered in the air, heavy and dark. Before the girl could ask more, a soft thump echoed from the far end of the temple. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make all of them lift their heads at once. Another sound followed, a faint scraping, like something being dragged lightly across stone. Marcia rose to her feet, her expression sharp. "Stay here," she instructed. But Licinia shook her head. "We go together." Her voice carried the authority of her age and experience, and no one questioned her. The Vestals moved toward the sound, quiet as drifting fabric. The girl stayed close behind Marcia, her heartbeat tapping hard against her ribs. When they reached the back hall, the air felt colder. Narrow beams of daylight filtered down from small windows near the ceiling, creating long pale columns of dust and shadow. They stepped carefully, glancing down the corridor. The sound had come from storage room, a place where ritual tools, spare lamps, and old scroll containers were kept. The door stood slightly ajar. Licinia pushed it open. Nothing jumped out. Nothing moved. The room was still except for a slow swirl of dust in the sunlight. But something had fallen. A clay container lay on its side, its lid cracked open on the floor. Marcia picked it up and examined it. "It's one of the old augury jars," she murmured. "Empty. Could it have fallen by itself?" one of the younger Vestals asked. Licinia didn't answer immediately. She lifted the jar, examining the shelf it had fallen from. Everything else was untouched, perfectly arranged. "It looks like it was pushed," she said quietly. A ripple of unease passed through the group. The girl stepped closer, staring at the cracked lid. Something about it tugged at her attention. A faint mark near the edge, like a dark smudge. She touched it lightly. It felt slightly warm. Warm, in a room that felt cold. She withdrew her hand quickly. Behind them, the flame flickered again, faint but distinct, even though they were far from the hearth. Almost as if it had felt their alarm. They returned to the main chamber in a tight group, whispering softly, watching the doorway and the flame with equal caution. The unease in the room had thickened. Not panic, not yet, but a kind of alertness that made every small sound feel important. Hours passed slowly. The sunlight shifted across the marble floor, stretching into long golden lines. The city outside roared with its usual afternoon life. Voices shouting, merchants calling out prices, wheels grinding over stone. But nothing inside the temple could drown out the sense that something was waiting. As the sun dipped lower, the atmosphere changed again. The warmth faded. A mild chill crept through the open spaces, brushing against their skin like cool breath. The girl glanced at the flame. It stood tall and steady now, calmer than before. Too calm. Marcia noticed it too. "It's almost still," she whispered. "Stillness is not always a good sign," Licinia murmured. The girl felt a shiver move through her. She remembered something her grandmother had once said before she joined the order, that sometimes before something breaks, the world holds its breath. The temple felt like it was holding its breath now. As evening approached, a soft tapping echoed through the doorway. 3 taps, then silence. The Vestals froze. The temple was closed to the public, and no one, not even a senator, would knock 3 times without calling out. The tapping came again. Gentle, slow, deliberate. Licinia stepped forward, her face pale. Marcia whispered, "No one open it." The flame swayed suddenly behind them, leaning toward the door again, as if recognizing the presence outside. The girl felt her stomach drop. Someone, or something, was waiting on the other side. The wind outside the old museum seemed to settle into a hush, as if even the night was waiting to hear what came next. Marcus walked a little slower now, not because he was tired, but because every new step seemed to open another corridor filled with unanswered questions. He kept thinking about the strange warmth he had felt earlier, that sense of standing on a threshold between the real world and something older. Lila, walking slightly ahead, didn't say anything for a while. She kept glancing at the glass around them, as if trying to picture the pieces of history not as artifacts, but as people who had lived entire lives inside those stone walls. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. She said she always wondered what the Vestal Virgins thought about at night, if they missed home, if they ever wished they could talk openly about the pressure placed on their young shoulders. Everything about them felt distant and yet strangely personal, like they existed in that quiet space between myth and memory. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure she could see him. He told her he imagined those girls standing under torchlight, listening to Rome breathe in the darkness, holding on to courage or fear or hope, whatever they had left. As they walked, his words seemed to take shape in the quiet halls. He said they weren't just symbols. They were real human beings with families, doubts, dreams, and responsibilities that were far heavier than their age should have allowed. Lila slowed down even more when she heard this, turning to look at Marcus as if his thought had pulled something loose from her own memories. She admitted that when she was younger, she wanted to be the kind of person who protected something sacred, even without understanding what it meant. She didn't want fame or authority. She just wanted to stand for something good. They reached a narrow aisle lined with small, everyday objects, tiny clay lamps, wooden combs, bits of textiles too fragile to touch. The labels were simple, almost quiet. These weren't treasures meant to impress, but things that carried the weight of ordinary life. And, somehow, that made them feel more powerful. Marcus stopped in front of Crack Bowl and said something about how history often focused on the big structures and the famous names, while the real story lived in the things people held, washed, or tucked beneath their beds. Lila smiled at that and said maybe that was why the Vestal Virgins fascinated people. They seemed distant, but the truth was hidden in moments that were probably simple and human, moments no one ever wrote down. The path took them toward a section of the museum that felt colder. The lights were softer, and Marcus could see their reflections stretching out like faint shadows. There was a single display standing in the center of the room, covered with a soft, thin cloth. Lila glanced at it, but didn't move closer yet. Instead, she looked around the dim space, as if expecting something to happen. She told Marcus that she once read about a ritual involving the Vestals, a moment when they had to walk alone through the sacred space of the temple at night, the city quiet around them. She said no one ever wrote about what they felt during those walks, but she imagined there must have been a mix of pride and fear. Marcus listened closely, picturing the flicker of lamps, the heavy silence, the way the marble halls must have echoed under their bare feet. They stood there for a long moment, as if they were inside that ancient silence themselves. Marcus realized he hadn't checked his phone in hours, hadn't thought about time, as though the museum had pulled them outside the usual rhythm of the day. Lila finally stepped toward the covered display and brushed her hand lightly along the edge of the cloth. She hesitated, looking over at Marcus before lifting it. But when she pulled it away, she didn't find a dramatic relic or a shining artifact. Instead, there was a small box inside the glass case, made of dark wood, almost simple enough to overlook. The label beneath, it explained that the box had been discovered near the site of the ancient temple of Vesta, its contents never fully understood. It mentioned charred fragments inside, hints of burned herbs and fabric, and a few tiny beads that historians thought might have belonged to a ceremonial necklace. Lila leaned closer, studying the faint burnt marks, and her voice dropped when she said she wondered who held that box last. Marcus joined her, and his breath fogged the glass slightly. He imagined a young Vestal standing on a cold morning, clutching the box before a ritual, thinking about something she could never say out loud. Maybe she was nervous, or maybe she was trying to steady herself. The box suddenly felt more alive than anything else in the room. Marcus found himself reaching out, not to touch it, but to feel closer to the idea of whoever once carried it. Lila said maybe the fragments inside were something personal, something that survived by accident, not because someone intended to preserve it. And that thought made Marcus uneasy, as if they were intruding on the last whisper of a long-lost secret. They walked to the next display, one that held a faded drawing of the temple layout. Lila traced the lines in the air with her finger. This curve for the sacred hearth, this small chamber for prayer, this path that only the Vestals could walk. She said the temple must have felt both comforting and suffocating, depending on the moment. Marcus imagined the walls glowing orange from the firelight, the soft crackle of the eternal flame that never should have gone out. He wondered aloud if the Vestals ever woke at night fearing the flame would die, knowing what failure could mean. Lila didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted again, not to the diagram, but to the space between the displays, as though listening to something neither of them could hear. She said she didn't think they feared the punishment as much as they feared letting down the people who trusted them. Marcus hadn't thought about it like that, but as soon as she said it, something about it felt true. He pictured them as young girls, not legends. He pictured their training, their laughter, their quiet frustration, their determination. The two of them moved slowly past each artifact, each one opening another small window into a world that felt close enough to touch. Marcus noticed the soft tremble in Lila's hands, not from fear, but from a sense of connection that was hard to describe. She said the strange thing about history is that sometimes you feel drawn to people you've never met, like a thread connecting the present to the past. But then, just as Marcus was starting to settle into that calm rhythm, something shifted, not around them, but inside the room. The lights flickered for a second, barely noticeable, but enough to make Lila glance up. Marcus looked around too, feeling the same sudden tension. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded different, but something felt different. He stepped back from the display, not out of fear, but because the air seemed to hold a quiet energy he couldn't explain. Lila whispered that it felt like the room had breathed out. Marcus tried to laugh it off, but the sound stayed trapped in his throat. They continued walking, but now the silence felt heavier, almost expectant. When they reached the final corner of the exhibit, Lila stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on something Marcus couldn't see yet. He walked around to stand beside her, and then he understood why she'd stopped. In front of them was a tall glass case holding a long, delicate piece of white fabric. It was faintly yellowed with age, almost transparent. The label said it had been discovered folded deep in the ruins of the House of the Vestals. Scientists believed it might have been part of a ceremonial veil, but they weren't sure. Marcus stared at it, feeling a chill he couldn't explain. The fabric seemed almost alive, like it carried stories that had never been spoken. Lila leaned closer, her breath shallow, and whispered that she felt like someone had stood in that exact spot centuries ago, adjusting that veil before a ritual. Marcus felt the same strange pull, as if the past wasn't behind them at all, but waiting just a few steps ahead. The museum suddenly felt too quiet, too still. He tried to focus on the logical explanations, the way old places play tricks on the mind, how dim lights can make anything feel mysterious. But none of that eased the sensation running through him. Lila broke the silence first, her voice barely more than a breath. She asked Marcus if he ever felt like history wasn't finished, like some parts lingered because they weren't ready to let go. Marcus didn't know how to answer. He only knew that he didn't want to move, and yet he didn't want to stay still either. Something about the veil felt like a threshold, one that might reveal something if they stayed long enough, or something they might regret stepping toward. And then, from somewhere deeper in the museum, a soft sound echoed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was just enough to make both of them turn their heads at the same moment. A tiny sound like something shifting in the dark. They looked at each other. Neither spoke, and neither moved, because whatever that sound wasn't part of the exhibits, and it wasn't part of the night janitor's routine either. Something else had shifted, and they weren't sure if they wanted to find out what it was. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, but the quiet around them made every inhale sound louder than it should have been. The museum felt different now, as if the walls were holding their breath right along with him and Lila. They both stood still for a moment, waiting to hear that sound again, hoping it had been nothing more than the building settling. But deep down, neither of them believed that. Something subtle but real had changed the moment that faint noise drifted out from the darkness. Lila was the first to move. She stepped slowly toward the direction of the sound, her footsteps careful and quiet. Marcus followed close behind, not wanting her to walk into the shadows alone. He felt the tension thicken with every step, the kind of tension that made his skin prickle. He tried to tell himself he was just reacting to the atmosphere, the dim light, the long halls full of ancient objects, the way history hung in the air like dust suspended in time. But the sensation inside his chest said something different. It said something was waiting. As they walked deeper into the next hallway, Lila kept her voice low. She wondered if maybe someone else was working late, or maybe a visitor had stayed behind without realizing the museum was closing soon. Marcus nodded, but the idea sounded thin and unconvincing. Whoever made that noise hadn't spoken, hadn't called out, hadn't turned on any lights. The sound had been too soft, too deliberate, like something shifting just out of sight. They reached a section of the museum where the displays were arranged closer together. This area was dedicated to small ritual tools and items used in ancient ceremonies. Bronze bowls, miniature figurines, incense burners, and small carved objects whose exact purposes had been lost to time. The soft glow of the lights gave everything a muted, golden haze. Lila paused in front of a tray of tiny beads, arranged in a careful circle under glass. She murmured that some archaeologists believe these beads belong to a special necklace worn only during major rituals involving the eternal flame. Marcus leaned in, imagining a young Vestal threading those beads through her fingers, steadying herself before the ceremony. But before he could say anything, another sound drifted through the hall. This one was different. Not a shift, not something falling, more like a slow scrape. Marcus felt the hairs on his neck rise in an instant. Lila looked at him, her eyes sharper now, the unease clear. She whispered that the sound came from somewhere ahead, near the older part of the exhibit. Marcus swallowed hard, nodding. They moved forward, but this time they stayed closer together, their shoulders almost touching. As they walked, Marcus's thoughts kept circling back to the Vestal Virgins. It felt strange, but the story of these women, guardians of the sacred flame, symbols of purity and duty, felt suddenly connected to the unease creeping through the museum. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because the exhibits held pieces of their world, fragments of lives wrapped in ritual and secrecy. Maybe it was because the mystery surrounding these women felt alive in this cold, late-night silence. Or maybe it was because the museum itself had a way of holding stories both told and untold, and sometimes those stories felt close enough to overhear. They turned a corner and found themselves in front of a long display featuring a reconstruction of the House of the Vestals. The structure was only partial, columns, fragments of marble, and a walkway meant to give visitors a sense of the scale and layout. Even though it was a replica, the shadows made it feel like they had stepped into the shell of an ancient temple. Lila let out a slow breath, saying it felt colder here. Marcus agreed. The air seemed to sit heavy in the space, carrying something unseen. He pointed toward a spot near the base of the marble, where something small lay on the floor. Lila crouched down, shining her phone's light on it. It was a tiny piece of plaster, chipped from somewhere above. She looked up, following the cracks in the display's decorative structure. It wasn't unusual for old museum installations to need repairs, but the freshly broken edges made Marcus uneasy. Lila whispered that maybe the building was reacting to the temperature, but that explanation felt weak. The plaster looked recently disturbed, as if someone or something had brushed against it. They rose quietly and continued toward the next room, but Lila hesitated again when she noticed something else. The velvet rope that normally blocked visitors from stepping too close to the reconstruction was slightly tilted, the end not fully hooked on a stand. She stared at it with a furrowed brow. Marcus moved closer, checking it carefully. It wasn't broken, but it looked touched, shifted just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Lila whispered that maybe one of the staff had moved it, but again, her voice lacked certainty. Marcus didn't answer. His focus drifted toward the dim hallway beyond the exhibit, where the shadows pooled thickest. He couldn't explain why, but he felt something waiting there, something just beyond the reach of the soft museum lights. They walked slowly toward the darkness. Lila kept her flashlight lowered, catching only faint glimpses of the tiled floor and cases lining the walls. Marcus felt the museum closing in around them, every sound amplified by the silence. He told himself to stay calm, but his heartbeat was beginning to drum louder in his ears. As they stepped deeper into the hallway, Lila suddenly stopped. Marcus almost bumped into her. She lifted her hand, signaling him to listen. He held his breath. There was again a faint scrape. Closer this time. Too close. Marcus looked around quickly, but saw only dim light and polished glass. Lila pointed toward a corner where a display pedestal stood slightly angled. It was empty, meaning whatever object once sat there had been removed for restoration. But that wasn't what caught her attention. On the floor beside the pedestal, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small trail of dust shifted across the tile, as if something had brushed through it moments earlier. Lila crouched down again, her eyes narrowing. Marcus felt his pulse climbing when she whispered that the dust wasn't from earlier today or yesterday. It looked freshly disturbed, like someone had dragged a fingertip or an object lightly through it. Marcus straightened up, scanning the hallway again. His voice was low when he said they weren't alone. Lila didn't argue this time. Her silence said everything. They moved again, slower now, each step careful. The hallway narrowed, pulling them into the older part of the museum where some of the artifacts were stored behind heavier glass with thicker locks. Lila said these were items that needed extra protection. Pieces connected to rituals, sacred symbols, and fragments from temples long gone. Marcus felt a chill at her words, as if the history stored here was heavier, more sensitive. They reached a door marked restricted access, staff only. It was locked, as it should have been. But Marcus noticed the faintest shift in the air near the seam of the doorframe, a cool draft that shouldn't have been there. Lila touched the handle gently. It didn't move, but something about the temperature made her pull her hand back quickly. She whispered that it felt cold, unnaturally cold. Marcus stepped back, not wanting to get any closer. He tried to convince himself that airflow could explain it, but the door was sealed well. Too well for air to slip through. Lila folded her arms tightly, as if trying to warm herself, though the rest of the museum felt normal. They turned away from the door, and Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling watched. Lila walked ahead a little, moving toward a small alcove with a single spotlight illuminating a carved stone tablet. Marcus followed, but then he froze. Lila hadn't seen it yet, but he had. There were faint footprints in the thin layer of dust near the corner. Not staff shoes, not sneakers, not heavy boots. Bare footprints. Small, light, almost delicate. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Lila turned when she noticed he had stopped, her voice soft but tense as she asked what was wrong. Marcus didn't know how to answer. He simply lifted his hand and pointed to the floor. Lila stepped closer, her face draining of color as she saw the prints for herself. They were unmistakable and fresh. She whispered his name, her voice trembling for the first time. Marcus took a step back, unable to tear his eyes away, because the footprints weren't just random marks in the dust. They were leading somewhere, deeper into the museum, straight toward the oldest part of the exhibit, where the story of the Vestal Virgins was carved into stone and shadow. And as they stared at the path those footprints made, both of them felt the same strange truth settle into the room. Something had walked through this hall, something that shouldn't still exist, and they had no idea where it was now or what it wanted. Marcus kept staring at those small, bare footprints as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. Lila stood beside him, her breath unsteady, trying to find some logical explanation, something that matched the real world. The museum floors weren't supposed to carry footprints like those, certainly not at night, and definitely not ones that looked like they belonged to someone from another time. But the more they stared, the harder it became to pretend this was just dust shifting or some trick of the light. Lila slowly knelt down, as if getting closer would somehow reveal a more reasonable answer. Marcus wanted to pull her back, to tell her not to touch anything, but her hand hovered just above the floor, shaking slightly. She didn't actually touch the prints. It was as if even she knew instinctively that it would be a mistake. Instead, she whispered that they looked fresh, not disturbed by air or footsteps or cleaning equipment. Fresh, as if someone had walked through only minutes earlier. Marcus swallowed hard. Whoever, or whatever, made them couldn't have gone far. They both turned their heads slightly, listening again for any sound. But the museum was silent, almost too silent. Lila whispered that they needed to follow the prints. Not because they wanted to, but because not knowing what made them would be far worse. Marcus nodded, although every part of him wished he could walk away, call security, turn on every light in the building, anything that kept him from going deeper into the darkness. But they walked anyway. The footprints led them into the narrowest part of the museum, the section with the oldest artifacts and the dimmest lights. The cases here were filled with objects most visitors barely glanced at. Fragments of marble, chipped pottery, faded drawings scratched on slabs of stone. These pieces weren't bright or impressive, but they held something heavier. Marcus felt at the moment they stepped inside, like walking into a pocket of air that didn't belong to the rest of the building. Lila said softly that these items came from ancient homes, private rooms, temple corners, places where people once whispered, prayed, or made promises they could never break. Marcus didn't know if those words comforted him or made the tension worse. He kept looking at the prints, watching them curve toward the back wall, where an old wooden door, long sealed shut, was framed by two tall display cases. He had seen that door a few times before on earlier visits. It didn't lead anywhere anymore, just an old storage area that had been blocked off decades ago. No one used it, no one opened it, and no one had any business standing near it. But the footprints stopped exactly in front of it. Lila stood still, staring at the dusty shapes. She whispered that this didn't make sense. The door was locked, sealed, and probably had been untouched for years. Marcus moved forward with slow steps, tried to see if anything looked disturbed. The wood was old and dark, its metal handle scratched with age. But something else caught his eye, a faint, thin line of dust missing from the bottom edge of the door, as though something small had moved beneath it. He stepped back quickly. Lila placed a hand on the door, not turning the knob, just resting her fingers lightly on the surface. The wood felt colder than anything else in the room. Marcus could tell from her expression that she felt it too, the same strange cold they'd sensed earlier near the staff-only door. This cold was sharper, almost like touching a block of stone that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. She murmured that they should check the other side, just to be sure. Marcus wanted to argue. He wanted to say they should leave it alone. But Lila was already moving toward the staff hallway, her footsteps soft but determined. Marcus followed reluctantly, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing near the door, watching them leave. The hallway to the maintenance area felt even darker, even quieter. When they reached the small room behind the sealed door, Lila unlocked it with her staff keycard. The second she opened it, they both froze. The air inside was freezing. Not cool, not drafty. Freezing. Lila stepped inside first, turning on the overhead light. It flickered for a moment before humming to life. The room was empty. No tools, no crates, no stored items. Just bare walls and a concrete floor with a faint coating of dust. Marcus exhaled shakily when he saw it. Bare footprints, the same delicate shape, leading across the room, straight to the back wall. Lila walked closer, her footsteps landing just beside the strange tracks. She stopped at the wall and ran her hand over the surface. It looked plain, unremarkable, slightly rough from age. But when she leaned in, her voice changed. It softened, as if she suddenly wasn't speaking to Marcus anymore, but to herself. There was a shallow carving near the base of the wall, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. A circle, inside it a flame. Marcus recognized it instantly. The symbol of the eternal fire of the Vestal Virgins. Lila whispered that this wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't part of any exhibit, any restoration project, or any known design. Marcus stepped closer, feeling the cold intensify as he approached the carving. Something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong in a way he couldn't explain. A quiet wrongness, like something had been placed there without permission from time itself. The footprints ended right at the carving. Not past it, not around it. Right there. Lila leaned in, tracing the symbol lightly without actually touching it. Her voice trembled when she spoke again. She said this symbol wasn't just decorative. It was sacred, something the Romans protected fiercely. It marked places of ritual, places where silence was required, places where outsiders weren't supposed to step. Marcus asked her what she thought it meant. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the carving, her mind racing through everything she knew about ancient rituals and the Vestal's role in preserving Rome's purity and safety. Finally, she whispered that sometimes symbols weren't just marks, they were boundaries. Marcus felt the chill slide deeper into the room. Lila said it again, slower this time, almost as if the walls needed to hear it too. A boundary, a line between what existed on one side and what existed on the other. Marcus stepped back instinctively, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He didn't want to imagine what might be on the other side of that boundary. But he couldn't stop the thought forming anyway. Maybe the footprints didn't come from this side of the wall. Maybe they came from the other. Lila suddenly turned off the light, as if trying to reset the room, try to make the strange, cold, and impossible footprints vanish with the darkness. But when she turned it back on, nothing changed. The prints were still there. The carving was still there. The chill still wrapped around them like a warning. Marcus said they should leave the room. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. Lila didn't argue this time. She stepped back quickly, closing the door behind them as if shutting it firmly would keep everything inside from slipping out. They stood in the hallway for a long moment, both breathing hard. Marcus finally asked the question they were both thinking but afraid to say out loud. What walked through that wall? Lila didn't answer him directly. Instead, she said they needed to check the security cameras to see if the system caught anything near the exhibit or the hallway. Marcus nodded, grateful for something practical to focus on, something that belonged to the real world. But as they walked toward the security room, both of them felt the same heavy sensation settling behind them, like the cold from the sealed room was following slowly, step by step, or like something else was, something walking barefoot. The closer they moved toward the heart of the city, the more Elias felt the quiet weight of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear and it wasn't excitement. It was more like the soft pull of a story he wasn't supposed to know, one that had been whispered for centuries yet never fully told. He tried to brush off the feeling, but every step toward the forum seemed to deepen it. Even Lucia, usually full of questions and comments, stayed silent, her eyes scanning the buildings as if they contained answers she couldn't yet reach. The air felt cooler here, more still, and when they reached the shadow of the Temple of Vesta, Elias paused without meaning to, as though the ground itself held a memory. Lucia glanced at him. "You all right?" she asked lightly, but her voice carried a hint of caution. Elias nodded, though his chest felt tight. They stood before the temple now, its circular walls gleaming faintly even in the fading light. The soft smell of smoke drifted from inside, mixed with the earthy scent of oil and ash. People moved around the forum, but none of them approached the temple too closely. They gave it a respectful distance, as though crossing an invisible boundary might disturb something sacred. Elias noticed it immediately, and the quiet separation only made the place feel more mysterious. He stepped closer, hearing the faint crackling of the sacred fire within. It wasn't loud, but felt alive, a low, steady breath that never stopped. Lucia leaned in too, though she kept her hands tucked into her sleeves, as if unsure whether she was allowed to stand this near. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the entrance where the flame flickered behind the shadows. Then a soft sound came from inside, an echo of footsteps, careful and measured. A young Vestal appeared, her white veil glowing faintly in the firelight. She didn't look at them directly, but she moved with a quiet certainty, as though she carried something in her that the world outside couldn't touch. Lucia exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's so young." The girl couldn't have been older than 14. Her face was calm, focused, but there was something else too, a hint of loneliness or maybe the weight of a life already chosen for her. Elias found himself staring, not out of curiosity, but because he suddenly understood that the stories he'd heard growing up hadn't captured the real thing. Seeing a Vestal Virgin in person made everything feel different. These weren't just figures from history books or ancient mythology. They were real people living inside a quiet world shaped by rules no one else lived under. As the Vestal disappeared back into the temple, Elias felt Lucia tug his sleeve gently. "There's something I need to show you," she murmured. Her tone had changed, less excited now, more serious. She glanced around the forum to make sure no one was paying attention. The crowd drifted in the distance, but no one seemed concerned with them. When she was sure the area was clear enough, she motioned him toward a narrow path that curved around the side of the temple. Elias hesitated. This wasn't part of their usual museum-like walk through history. This felt different, like stepping into a restricted corridor. Still, he followed her. The path was shaded and quiet, separated from the open forum by tall walls. The air felt cooler here, and each step echoed just a little. They passed a small courtyard with worn stones and what looked like storage jars, but Lucia didn't stop. She kept moving until they reached a corner where the wall curved inward, forming a small hidden space. There, almost swallowed by shadow, stood a weathered inscription carved deep into the stone. It looked old, far older than the rest of the restored architecture around them. Lucia stepped aside so he could see it fully. I found this by accident when I was walking here last week. Her voice lowered even more. I don't think it's marked on the site maps. Elias leaned closer, squinting at the words. Some letters were faint, worn by centuries of wind and time, but he could still make out the shapes. The inscription wasn't long, and the Latin was rougher than the usual polished state carvings. It looked like something left behind by someone who wasn't supposed to leave messages at all. What does it say? Elias asked, keeping his voice soft. Lucia traced her finger under the text without touching it. Something like, "The fire remembers. Ask what was taken." Elias blinked. "Taken?" Lucia nodded once. "And it's dated, well, at least based on the style, it looks like something from the later Republic. Maybe written when there was political tension or upheaval." She paused. "Or when something happened to the Vestals." Elias felt a small chill move down his spine. Stories about the Vestal Virgins always carried a sense of mystery, but this felt different. This was specific, almost personal. He tried to imagine someone carving those words in secret, hidden from the public eye. He imagined someone who knew something the rest of Rome didn't. Someone who was desperate for the truth to survive. "But what do you think it means?" Elias asked. Lucia folded her arms lightly across her chest. "That's the part one can't figure out. The fire remembers could be symbolic. Maybe it's talking about memory or tradition. But ask what was taken, that sounds like something or someone disappeared." The idea unsettled Elias more than he expected. He glanced back toward the temple entrance where the sacred fire still flickered. The Vestals were responsible for guarding the flame, for protecting it with their lives. If something had been taken from them, the consequences would have been serious, both politically and spiritually. He stepped back from the inscription, his mind spinning with possibilities. Lucia watched him with a thoughtful expression. "There's a reason I waited to show you this," she said quietly. "I've been doing research, talking to people who work here, reading old documents. But there's something odd. Every time I ask about missing records or unexplained events, people avoid the topic. It's like they know something but won't say it." Elias felt tension tighten in his chest again, a slow and steady pressure. "You think the inscription is connected to something bigger?" he asked. Lucia hesitated, then nodded. "I think the history we learned, the calm, polished version, left something out. Something the Vestals carried or protected, something that maybe never made it into official records." She paused again, her eyes flickering toward the temple. "And I think some people still want that secret buried." The quiet around them suddenly felt heavier. Elias turned, listening for footsteps or voices, but the path remained empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the air had shifted, as if the temple itself knew they were talking about something sacred. Lucia stepped closer, lowering her voice even more. "There's someone I want you to meet. She works inside the complex. She knows more about the old rituals, the ones we don't really talk about during tours." Elias swallowed. "Is she allowed to talk about them?" Lucia gave a small, uncertain shrug. "I don't know, but she said she's been waiting for the right moment." Elias frowned slightly. "The right moment for what?" Lucia didn't answer immediately. Her eyes met his, and something in her expression made him realize she wasn't telling him everything yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure how deep the story went. Let's just say that she believes the sacred fire wasn't only a symbol, Lucia whispered. She thinks it was connected to something much more important. Something that may explain why certain records seem to be missing. Elias felt a slow rush of questions rising inside him, but Lucia held up a hand gently, signaling him to stay calm. "We'll talk to her tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, just keep your mind open." They stepped away from the hidden corner and walked back toward the forum. The light was dimmer now, shadows stretching long across the stones. The temple seemed even more mysterious in the approaching night, the flame inside glowing like a quiet heartbeat. As they reached the main path again, Elias glanced back over his shoulder. The temple loomed silently, guarding its secrets. The inscription's message echoed in his mind. Ask what was taken. And for the first time, he wondered if they were already too close to something they weren't supposed to uncover. The night settled over Rome in a soft, hazy quiet, and the city lights shimmered like distant memories across the rooftops. Elias lay awake in the small guest room Lucia had arranged for him, staring up at the wooden beams overhead. He could still smell the faint traces of smoke from the sacred fire, even though he was miles from the temple of Vesta now. It clung to him, or maybe he only imagined it. Either way, the sensation refused to fade. He turned onto his side and exhaled slowly, trying to calm the thoughts spinning through his mind. But the inscription, those rough, urgent words, felt like a whisper repeating itself in the dark. Ask what was taken. He didn't know why it bothered him so much, but something about it felt too direct to ignore. History didn't usually leave messages that personal. Most inscriptions were formal declarations, praises of emperors, or recordings of laws. But this read like a quiet warning from someone long gone. Elias closed his eyes, hoping sleep would come, but it didn't, not even for a moment. By dawn, he'd barely rested, yet the moment he stepped outside, he felt a strange determination settle in him. Lucia was waiting near the entrance of the complex, wrapped in a light shawl, her hair tied back loosely as though she hadn't slept much either. When she saw him, she gave a small, knowing smile, one that told him she felt the same unease, the same curiosity. "You ready?" she asked softly. Elias nodded, though his stomach tightened. "Who exactly are we meeting?" Lucia glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Her name is Marcia. She's been working with the historical preservation team for years. She specializes in religious artifacts, especially those related to the Vestal Virgins. She told me she found something years ago, but was told not to pursue it." Lucia paused. She didn't say what. Elias frowned. "You trust her?" Lucia hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "I think she wants the truth out." But she lowered her voice. "I also think she's scared." That alone made Elias feel both more anxious and more determined. They walked together through the quiet morning streets until they reached a side entrance near the house of the Vestals. Marcia appeared moments later, moving with a cautious grace. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with sharp eyes that gave the impression she noticed everything. And yet there was something soft about her, something tired. She carried a stack of worn documents pressed tightly against her chest, as though she feared losing them. "Lucia," she murmured, offering a faint smile. "And you must be Elias." Elias introduced himself politely, but he noticed Marcia's eyes drift toward the temple behind them, as though checking for watchers. Only when she seemed satisfied that no one was lingering nearby did she motion for them to follow her through a narrow doorway. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust floated lazily in the sunlight that filtered through tall windows, illuminating shelves lined with scrolls, pottery fragments, and delicate artifacts waiting to be studied. Marcia led them into a small room off to the side and closed the door behind them. Only then did she exhale, the tension leaving her shoulders slightly. "I don't have much time," she said in a low voice, "but I've been waiting for someone willing to listen." Lucia exchanged a brief glance with Elias. "Tell us everything," she said. Marcia set her documents on the table, spreading out a few pages. They looked old. Some were handwritten notes, others photocopies of ancient texts. She pointed to one particular page. "This is from a fragmented record dated somewhere around the late Republic. Most of it is missing, but there's a passage that mentions an incident inside the temple of Vesta. Elias leaned in. The handwriting was faint and uneven, but the words were unmistakable. The guardians were troubled. Something sacred was lost. What was lost? Elias asked quietly. That's what no one agrees on, Marcia replied. Some think it refers to a stolen artifact. Others think it was a ritual disrupted. But there's one theory, one I was told not to pursue, that it involved a person. Lucia's breath caught. A Vestal. Marcia nodded slowly. There were whispers, only faint hints and secondary sources, about a young Vestal who disappeared. No trial, no record of punishment, no mention of death. She clasped her hands tightly, as though steadying herself. She simply vanished. Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. The Vestal Virgins lived under strict rules, but they were also protected fiercely by the state. A disappearance should have created panic, political uproar, even public outrage. But there was nothing, no historical trace. How could something like that be hidden? Elias asked. Marcia hesitated, her eyes dimming. Because someone wanted it hidden. Silence filled the room, heavy and unsettling. Elias felt his pulse quicken. Lucia leaned forward. Is this connected to the inscription we found? Marcia gave a faint, bitter smile. I'm not surprised you found it. That carving has been ignored for decades. And yes, many believe it was left by someone close to the disappeared Vestal. Maybe even someone who tried to protect her. Elias swallowed hard. The thought of a scared young girl, caught in the political shadows of ancient Rome, felt painfully real now. He tried to imagine her walking between the stone walls, carrying the weight of rituals and expectations. He tried to imagine the fear she must have felt if she realized someone wanted her gone. What happened to her? Elias asked softly. Marcia looked down at the papers, her voice almost a whisper. We don't know. Every record that might mention her ends abruptly. Every clue stops halfway. It's like history swallowed her whole. Lucia rested her fingers lightly on the table, processing the information. And you think the sacred fire remembers? Marcia nodded. The Vestals believed the fire carried memory, that through it, Vesta herself saw everything. If something wrong happened in that temple, they believed the flame knew. That's why the fire could never go out. It wasn't just symbolic, it was a witness. Elias felt a shiver pass through him. The temple suddenly felt less like a historical site and more like a living thing, holding stories too heavy for time to erase. Marcia gathered her papers again. There is something else, she murmured. Something I hesitated to tell you. Both Elias and Lucia looked at her expectantly. Marcia hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly against the worn parchment. Yesterday, before you found the inscription, one of the guards reported seeing a flicker in the part of the temple where the fire shouldn't reach. A glow, a shadow moving near the old foundation. She looked up at them, her eyes wide. There hasn't been a flame there in over 17 centuries. Elias' breath caught, the room suddenly too small, too quiet. Lucia stared. Are you saying? Marcia cut her off gently. I'm not saying anything, but I think whatever happened in that temple, whatever was taken, isn't finished. Elias felt the tension settle deep in his chest, the kind of quiet pressure that didn't feel like fear, but like standing at the edge of something about to shift. Then Marcia straightened abruptly, her expression tightening. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Someone was coming. Lucia's eyes widened. Marcia quickly gathered the papers, pressing them into a drawer and sliding it shut. Go, she whispered urgently. Both of you. And don't come back here today. Elias didn't question her. He and Lucia slipped out the side door, the air outside striking them like a sudden gust of freedom, but also danger. As they hurried down the path, Elias glanced back at the doorway they just exited. A shadow moved inside, brief and silent. Someone else had been listening. Elias didn't slow down until he and Lucia reached the edge of the forum, where the crowds softened the tension that had clung to them since leaving Marcia's office. The noise of vendors setting up for the day should have been comforting, but instead it made everything feel sharper, like each sound carried a warning hidden beneath it. Lucia glanced over her shoulder again and again, her breath uneven. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "In the doorway?" Elias nodded, though he wasn't sure if he had truly seen a person or if his mind, already tangled in the mystery, had imagined it. Still, the fear in Marcia's voice had been real. Someone had been close enough to hear every detail. The disappearance of the Vestal, the secret inscription, the sacred fire. And whoever it was, they didn't want Marcia talking. Lucia stopped walking, pulling her phone from her pocket. "We should check on her," she murmured, but her fingers hovered uncertainly. "But if someone is watching," she trailed off, pressing her lips together. Elias took a slow breath. "Let's give her a little time. She told us to go for a reason." Lucia didn't argue, but her worry was clear. They found a quieter street and leaned against a stone wall, trying to collect their thoughts. Elias felt like each piece of the puzzle had grown heavier instead of clearer, and something inside him kept circling back to the same thought: the girl who vanished, the missing Vestal, the witness fire, the rushed, panicked inscription, and now a shadow listening. None of this was coincidence. Lucia rubbed her hands together nervously. "Elias, what if this isn't just about a mystery from ancient Rome? What if someone today is invested in keeping it buried?" Elias didn't answer at first, but the idea made perfect sense. Historical discoveries sometimes threaten reputations, funding, claims over artifacts. There are always layers of politics in archaeology. But this felt bigger, more personal, more dangerous. Before he could reply, Lucia's phone buzzed softly. A message from an unknown number flashed on her screen. She frowned at it and opened it. A single line appeared. "Stop looking." Her breath left her body. Elias stepped closer. "What does it say?" She tilted the screen toward him. The words were stark, cold, and sent a chill all the way through him. "Who would send this?" Lucia muttered, her voice shaking. Elias shook his head slowly. "Someone who knows exactly what we're doing." Lucia swallowed hard. "But I didn't text anyone. I didn't post anything. I've only spoken to you and Marcia." Elias's thoughts raced. Someone must have been following them longer than they realized. Someone connected to the temple or the preservation project, someone with access. The warning wasn't just to scare them. It was a reminder that they were already being watched. Before either of them could say anything else, Elias's phone buzzed too. He pulled out slowly, dread creeping in. Another unknown number. Another message. This one was worse. "Turn back. There is no girl." Elias felt the world narrow for a moment. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. Lucia stared at the text, confusion tightening her features. "What does that mean?" she breathed. Elias didn't know, but the message felt like a denial, a rewriting of history itself. Whoever sent it didn't want them looking for the missing Vestal. They didn't even want her existence acknowledged. And if someone was trying so hard to erase her, then she wasn't just a forgotten figure from a fragmented record. She mattered. Someone had buried her story deliberately, forcefully, perhaps violently. "We need to see the temple again," Elias said quietly. Lucia blinked, startled. "Now? After this?" Elias nodded slowly. "The warning, it's too specific. Whoever sent it knows exactly what part of the story we're following. Which means the answer is there." Lucia hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. But finally, she nodded. "All right, but we have to be careful." They made their way back through the winding streets, avoiding the main entrances and instead approaching from an older, less used path behind the ruins. The air felt heavier here, as though the stones themselves were listening. Elias kept glancing behind them, half expecting someone to appear from around a corner, but for now they seemed alone. When they reached the rear of the temple complex, Elias noticed something strange. A rope barrier had been moved since yesterday. It was shifted inward, blocking off the narrow walkway that led to the old foundation where Marcia said the strange glow had been seen. Lucia frowned. "Did they close this last night?" "No," Elias replied softly. "Someone doesn't want anyone going back there." They slipped past the rope anyway, moving quietly. As they approached the foundation stones, Elias noticed new footprints in the dust. Large ones, like from a heavy boot. And smaller ones too, lighter, like someone who had walked carefully. Lucia knelt beside them. These weren't here before. Elias nodded. Someone came after we left. He crouched down and brushed the dust aside, revealing something glinting faintly beneath the morning light. It was tiny, barely half an inch long, but undeniably deliberate. A scrap of gold thread. Lucia leaned closer. Is that? Elias lifted it gently. The thread shimmered softly, intricately woven. It looked old, impossibly old, like it belonged to ceremonial clothing, like it belonged to a Vestal Virgin. His heart pounded. This isn't supposed to be here. Lucia stood, scanning the area nervously. Elias, if this came from a Vestal garment and it's newly uncovered, then something moved it. Or someone. Elias opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a distant crack echoed behind the wall. Not loud, but sharp enough to be deliberate, like a stone shifting under weight. Someone was there. Lucia grabbed his sleeve. We need to go. But Elias hesitated. Something near the foundation had caught his eye, a dark shape tucked between two old stones. He reached for it quickly, pulling out a small piece of folded parchment, brittle with age but disturbingly clean, as though it hadn't been buried for centuries. Lucia's voice shook. Where did that come from? Elias unfolded it carefully. The writing was faint but legible, written in rushed Latin. She burns, but not in flames. His breath hitched. Lucia took a step back. Elias, what does that mean? Before he could answer, the crack behind them grew louder. Footsteps now, unmistakable, closing in slowly, deliberately. Someone was coming toward the foundation, and they weren't hiding anymore. Elias felt a cold sweat run down his back. The words on the parchment were heavy, almost impossible to interpret, yet they carried the weight of centuries. Urgent, secret, and dangerous. He glanced at Lucia, whose wide eyes reflected the same fear he felt. Both of them understood that this wasn't just a historical puzzle anymore. Someone, or something, was deliberately guiding them toward it, or perhaps trying to trap them. Move, Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. Elias didn't need to be told twice. They stepped back carefully, keeping their feet light on the uneven stones, but as they moved, a shadow flickered across the corner of his vision. He froze for a split second, his heart hammering. The footsteps behind them weren't running, but they were deliberate, calculated, moving closer in a rhythm that matched the tension in his chest. Whoever it was, they weren't here by accident. Lucia grabbed his hand. There's a side path, she said, pointing to a narrow corridor between the ancient stones. We can get out that way. Elias followed, keeping low and careful. Dust rose slightly with each step, tiny motes catching the faint morning light like stars. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the shadowed corridor, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones rather than simply brushing against their skin. He glanced down at the parchment again. The phrase, "She burns but not in flames," repeated in his mind, a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. They reached the edge of a small courtyard and paused, catching their breath. The footsteps had stopped too, as though the person following them had sensed their movement and was now waiting, watching. Elias felt his pulse spike. He peered around the corner, scanning the courtyard. It was empty, or at least appeared empty. Do you think it's Marcia? Lucia whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. No, Marcia warned us. This, whoever it is, they don't want us finding her. He held the parchment tightly, as if it were the only piece of armor he had. Lucia's gaze flicked toward a low stone wall at the far end of the courtyard. There, she breathed. A ladder. Elias saw it too, a rickety wooden ladder leaning against the wall, just old enough to blend into the shadows. It's our only way up, he said. They climbed quickly but carefully, the ladder creaking under their weight. Elias's mind raced. The artifact, the hidden messages, the unexplained glow, all of it pointed to something larger than any historical theory. The stakes weren't just academic anymore. Someone was actively guarding the secrets of the Vestals. And if they failed to move carefully, they could become part of that secret themselves. At the top of the ladder, they found themselves on a narrow roof ledge, overlooking a secondary courtyard that was even quieter than the first. Sunlight spilled across the stones, but it didn't bring warmth. Every shadow seemed deeper here, more deliberate. Elias pressed himself against the wall, peering down to see if they had been followed. The space below was empty, at least for now. Lucia leaned in close, her voice low. "We need a plan. Whoever is after us is patient. They know where we've been." Elias nodded. "We can't go back to Marcia yet. They'll be expecting that. But we have to find out what this parchment means." He glanced down at the words again. "She burns, but not in flames." It wasn't metaphorical, he realized. It wasn't about fire at all. In some way, it was literal. Someone, or something, was hidden in plain sight, carrying a danger that didn't look like danger. As they move along the ledge, a sudden noise made both of them freeze, a soft scraping, like stone shifting beneath weight. Elias's stomach tightened. He motioned for Lucia to stop, pressing his finger to his lips. They crouched low, listening. Footsteps, not from the courtyard below. Above them, a figure emerged from a shadowed doorway, tall and silent, moving with deliberate care across the roof. The sunlight caught the edge of a cloak, making it glint in a way that was unnatural. Elias and Lucia pressed themselves flat against the stone, hearts pounding. Whoever it was, it didn't seem human, or at least not ordinary. The figure paused mid-step, tilting its head as if sensing their presence. Elias's breath caught. It was too calm, too patient to be just a person. It carried authority, almost a ritualistic precision, as though it belonged to the same hidden world as the Vestals themselves. Lucia whispered, "We need to move. Now." They edged toward the opposite side of the roof, carefully placing their feet where the stones were more secure. Every step felt like an eternity. Behind them, the figure didn't move, just stood, watching, waiting. Elias's mind raced. What did it want? Was it protecting the secret of the missing Vestal, or hunting them for uncovering it? Then, just as they reached the corner, a soft, almost musical voice called out, "You shouldn't be here." Elias and Lucia froze. The voice was feminine, soft yet commanding, carrying an authority that made the hairs on the back of Elias's neck stand up. It didn't come from the figure. They couldn't see anyone else nearby, but the sound seemed to fill the entire rooftop, vibrating against the walls and stones like an invisible pulse. Lucia's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Elias nodded, swallowing hard. It came from somewhere inside the temple. The words on the parchment, "She burns but not in flames," hit him suddenly. The voice, they were hearing it now, in real time, wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. Someone, or something, was alive, hidden, and aware of their presence. Footsteps began again, soft at first, then more distinct, echoing across the courtyard below. Elias realized with a sinking feeling that they were surrounded. The path back was no longer safe. Every escape route they had considered led directly into whoever was orchestrating this hunt. Lucia grabbed his arm, urgency blazing in her eyes. "We have to keep moving. That voice, it's part of the secret." Elias nodded, gripping the parchment tightly. He glanced toward a small chimney at the edge of the roof, a narrow passage that might lead into the inner chambers of the temple. Risky, but it could be their only chance. As they approached, the figure on the roof moved with sudden speed, gliding closer, cutting off their path. Elias froze, heart racing. The figure raised an arm slowly, deliberately, pointing toward them. There was no aggression, no sudden lunge, but the gesture carried power. Control. Command. Then the voice spoke again, clearer this time. "You must leave before the fire remembers fully." Elias's mind whirled. The fire remembers. That phrase Marcia had used. The sacred flame wasn't just a symbol. It was a witness, a guardian, and possibly a weapon. If the flame remembered, then something or someone would act on that memory. Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. "Elias, it knows we found the thread, the parchment, everything." Elias's grip tightened. "We can't stop now. We're too close." The figure stepped closer, and the sunlight revealed the face, masked in shadow, features obscured, but unmistakably human. And yet, The aura it carried was more than human. It radiated history, ritual, and a chilling authority. Footsteps thundered from the courtyard below, closer now. Someone else, or multiple people, were moving in, and the narrow rooftop offered no real escape. Elias realized, with a sudden clarity that made his blood run cold, that the secrets of the Vestals weren't buried in the past. They were alive. Someone was protecting them, following them, and waiting for the exact moment to act. Lucia grabbed his hand, whispering, "We have to choose, up into the temple or back into the courtyard." Elias looked at the masked figure again. There was no hesitation in the way it moved. It wasn't just watching them. It was expecting them, almost inviting them into the danger. And in that instant, he understood that whatever awaited them inside the temple, or behind the foundation walls, would change everything they thought they knew about the Vestals, about the sacred fire, about the girl who vanished centuries ago. He swallowed hard. "We go in," he said. Lucia nodded, though fear and determination warred in her eyes. Together, they stepped toward the hidden doorway leading into the temple's inner chamber, the masked figure gliding silently behind them, the sounds of pursuit growing louder with each heartbeat. Elias felt the weight of history pressing down, a tangible force, as if every stone, every artifact, every shadow had been waiting for this moment. And he knew, without a doubt, that what they were about to uncover would be far more dangerous and far more revealing than anything they had imagined. The secret of the Vestal Virgins was about to awaken, and nothing would ever be the same. Elias's heart pounded as he and Lucia stepped through the narrow doorway into the temple's inner chamber. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of smoke, mixed with something older, something like incense that hadn't been burned in centuries. The faint glow from the sacred fire ahead illuminated the room in flickering gold, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The masked figure followed silently, its presence commanding yet strangely patient, as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment. As they advanced, Elias noticed a raised platform at the center of the chamber. On it lay objects unlike anything he had seen in the museum or any historical record: ceremonial robes, fragments of jewelry, and a small, intricately carved statue of Vesta herself. The flame burned brighter here, almost alive, and it seemed to pulse with energy, reflecting in Elias's wide eyes. Lucia stepped forward, careful not to touch anything. This is incredible," she whispered. "It's like a hidden archive of the Vestal's real history, all of it preserved, untouched for centuries." Then a soft, deliberate sound made them both freeze, the shuffle of movement from the shadows at the back of the chamber. A figure stepped into the golden light. Not the masked figure. They were separate, taller, dressed in flowing white robes that glimmered in the firelight. Her face was partially veiled, but Elias could see the faintest traces of youth, yet also a strange agelessness. She held something in her hand, a small, delicate flame trapped in a glass container, flickering but not burning the air around it. "The girl," Elias breathed. Lucia swallowed. "The Vestal, she's alive?" The woman's voice was soft but firm, echoing through the chamber. "I've been waiting for someone who could see the truth." Her eyes met theirs, and Elias felt a chill. The fire remembers everything. What was lost, what was stolen, what was hidden. And now, finally, it can be shared. The masked figure moved closer, bowing slightly, and Elias realized it wasn't threatening them. It was guarding, protecting. Somehow, all along, the shadow had been ensuring they reached this exact point. The young Vestal stepped forward, placing the glass flame on the platform beside the statue. She lifted her hands slowly, her eyes reflecting the sacred fire. "Long ago, I was taken, not punished, not erased, but hidden. The powerful fear the knowledge I carried, the rituals, the history, the understanding of the fire that witnesses all. I was meant to protect it, to ensure no one could exploit what the Vestals held sacred." Elias's mind reeled. The missing records, the vanished girl, the glimmering thread, the hidden messages, it all connected. The fire wasn't just ceremonial. It was a vessel of memory, a living archive. The girl hadn't disappeared. She had become the guardian of Rome's most closely held secret. Lucia stepped closer, awe and disbelief in her eyes. So everything, the warnings, the shadows, the messages, it was to guide us here. The Vestal nodded. Yes, only those who could understand without fear would reach this place. Only those willing to carry the truth forward responsibly would witness it. Elias felt the weight of centuries settle around him. All the mystery, all the tension led to this revelation. The missing Vestal was alive. The sacred fire had witnessed her journey, and now the hidden truth of the Vestal's purpose was in their presence. Then the unexpected happened. The flame in the glass flickered violently, brighter than it had before, casting sudden, sharp shadows across the walls. A soft hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor, the stones, their bones. The Vestal's calm expression changed slightly. Concern flickered in her eyes. "They come," she whispered. Before Elias or Lucia could react, the shadows in the corners of the chamber shifted violently. Figures emerged, tall, cloaked, moving with unnatural grace. These weren't guards, not fully human either. A protective force or a curse bound to the fire itself had awakened. They moved toward the glass flame, intent and purposeful. Elias grabbed Lucia's hand instinctively. "We need to," but the Vestal raised a hand, her voice firm, commanding. "No, they are not here to harm. They are the guardians, as I have always been. They will test your intent. If you are here to witness and protect the truth, they will let you leave with it." The cloaked figures approached, silent except for the hum of the fire. Elias and Lucia remained frozen, hearts hammering, unsure what this test would require. The Vestal lifted the glass flame, holding it above her head. The light spread, illuminating the entire chamber. The figures paused, circling them in perfect, deliberate harmony. Then one stepped forward. Its hood fell back, revealing a face older than time, yet strikingly human. "You seek history," it said. "Do you understand the weight of what you carry? If you speak, if you reveal the fire's memory, the world may not be ready." Elias swallowed. "We understand. We only want the truth to be remembered." The figure nodded slowly, the others stepping back. The hum faded. The flame stilled. The tension in the room eased, replaced by a quiet reverence. The fire had tested them and found them worthy. The Vestal placed the glass flame back on the platform. "The secret can leave this chamber with you," she said. "But remember, the story is fragile. Misuse it, and it could be lost again or worse." Lucia nodded solemnly, her eyes wide. "We'll protect it. We'll tell the story carefully." Elias exhaled, a mix of relief and awe washing over him. After centuries of mystery, after shadows, warnings, disappearances, and fear, they finally understood. The fire remembered. The Vestal had survived. And now, the hidden truth of the sacred rituals could live on. But just as Elias reached for the glass flame, the parchment they had found earlier fluttered across the platform. He picked it up. On the back, written in a delicate hand, were words that made his blood run cold. "Not all who are hidden wish to be found." He looked up at the Vestal. She smiled faintly, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You have learned the truth," she said softly. "But remember this. The fire may remember, but not all memories are meant to be shared. Some are still waiting and watching." Elias and Lucia exchanged a tense glance, the weight of the final warning settling in. They had resolved the mystery of the missing Vestal, uncovered the secret of the sacred fire, and survived the tests of the guardians. But the message left an undeniable unease. Some part of the story, it seemed, was not yet finished. And as they left the chamber, the shadows behind the platform shifted once more, almost imperceptibly. But Elias could swear he saw the faintest trace of another figure, watching, waiting, perhaps the last secret of the Vestals, still hidden, still alive, still guarding what the world was not yet ready to see. The story was resolved, yet the mystery lingered, like a quiet ember, ready to flare again. Elias's heart pounded as he and Lucia stepped through the narrow doorway into the temple's inner chamber. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of smoke, mixed with something older, something like incense that hadn't been burned in centuries. The faint glow from the sacred fire ahead illuminated the room in flickering gold, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The masked figure followed silently, its presence commanding yet strangely patient, as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment. As they advanced, Elias noticed a raised platform at the center of the chamber. On it lay objects unlike anything he had seen in the museum or any historical record: ceremonial robes, fragments of jewelry, and a small, intricately carved statue of Vesta herself. The flame burned brighter here, almost alive, and it seemed to pulse with energy, reflecting in Elias's wide eyes. Lucia stepped forward, careful not to touch anything. This is incredible," she whispered. "It's like a hidden archive of the Vestal's real history, all of it preserved, untouched for centuries." Then a soft, deliberate sound made them both freeze, the shuffle of movement from the shadows at the back of the chamber. A figure stepped into the golden light. Not the masked figure. They were separate, taller, dressed in flowing white robes that glimmered in the firelight. Her face was partially veiled, but Elias could see the faintest traces of youth, yet also a strange agelessness. She held something in her hand, a small, delicate flame trapped in a glass container, flickering but not burning the air around it. "The girl," Elias breathed. Lucia swallowed. "The Vestal, she's alive?" The woman's voice was soft but firm, echoing through the chamber. "I've been waiting for someone who could see the truth." Her eyes met theirs, and Elias felt a chill. The fire remembers everything. What was lost, what was stolen, what was hidden. And now, finally, it can be shared. The masked figure moved closer, bowing slightly, and Elias realized it wasn't threatening them. It was guarding, protecting. Somehow, all along, the shadow had been ensuring they reached this exact point. The young Vestal stepped forward, placing the glass flame on the platform beside the statue. She lifted her hands slowly, her eyes reflecting the sacred fire. "Long ago, I was taken, not punished, not erased, but hidden. The powerful fear the knowledge I carried, the rituals, the history, the understanding of the fire that witnesses all. I was meant to protect it, to ensure no one could exploit what the Vestals held sacred." Elias's mind reeled. The missing records, the vanished girl, the glimmering thread, the hidden messages, it all connected. The fire wasn't just ceremonial. It was a vessel of memory, a living archive. The girl hadn't disappeared. She had become the guardian of Rome's most closely held secret. Lucia stepped closer, awe and disbelief in her eyes. "So everything, the warnings, the shadows, the messages, it was to guide us here?" The Vestal nodded. "Yes. Only those who could understand without fear would reach this place. Only those willing to carry the truth forward, responsibly, would witness it." Elias felt the weight of centuries settle around him. All the mystery, all the tension led to this revelation. The missing Vestal was alive. The sacred fire had witnessed her journey, and now the hidden truth of the Vestal's purpose was in their presence. Then the unexpected happened. The flame in the glass flickered violently, brighter than it had before, casting sudden, sharp shadows across the walls. A soft hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor, the stones, their bones. The Vestal's calm expression changed slightly. Concern flickered in her eyes. "They come," she whispered. Before Elias or Lucia could react, the shadows in the corners of the chamber shifted violently. Figures emerged, tall, cloaked, moving with unnatural grace. These weren't guards, not fully human either. A protective force or a curse bound to the fire itself had awakened. They moved toward the glass flame, intent and purposeful. Elias grabbed Lucia's hand instinctively. "We need to—" But the Vestal raised a hand, her voice firm, commanding. "No, they are not here to harm. They are the guardians, as I have always been. They will test your intent." If you are here to witness and protect the truth, they will let you leave with it. The cloaked figures approached, silent except for the hum of the fire. Elias and Lucia remained frozen, hearts hammering, unsure what this test would require. The Vestal lifted the glass flame, holding it above her head. The lights spread, illuminating the entire chamber. The figures paused, circling them in perfect, deliberate harmony. Then one stepped forward. Its hood fell back, revealing a face older than time, yet strikingly human. "You seek history," it said. "Do you understand the weight of what you carry? If you speak, if you reveal the fire's memory, the world may not be ready." Elias swallowed. "We understand. We only want the truth to be remembered." The figure nodded slowly, the others stepping back. The hum faded. The flame stilled. The tension in the room eased, replaced by a quiet reverence. The fire had tested them and found them worthy. The Vestal placed the glass flame back on the platform. "The secret can leave this chamber with you," she said. "But remember, the story is fragile. Misuse it, and it could be lost again or worse." Lucia nodded solemnly, her eyes wide. "We'll protect it. We'll tell the story carefully." Elias exhaled, a mix of relief and awe washing over him. After centuries of mystery, after shadows, warnings, disappearances, and fear, they finally understood. The fire remembered. The Vestal had survived. And now, the hidden truth of the sacred rituals could live on. But just as Elias reached for the glass flame, the parchment they had found earlier fluttered across the platform. He picked it up. On the back, written in a delicate hand, were words that made his blood run cold. "Not all who are hidden wish to be found." He looked up at the Vestal. She smiled faintly, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You have learned the truth," she said softly. "But remember this. The fire may remember, but not all memories are meant to be shared. Some are still waiting and watching." Elias and Lucia exchanged a tense glance, the weight of the final warning settling in. They had resolved the mystery of the missing Vestal, uncovered the secret of the sacred fire, and survived the tests of the Guardians. But the message left an undeniable unease. Some part of the story, it seemed, was not yet finished. And as they left the chamber, the shadows behind the platform shifted once more, almost imperceptibly. But Elias could swear he saw the faintest trace of another figure, watching, waiting, perhaps the last secret of the Vestals, still hidden, still alive, still guarding what the world was not yet ready to see. The story was resolved, yet the mystery lingered, like a quiet ember, ready to flare again. Elias and Lucia emerged from the temple's inner chamber into the cool morning air, their legs trembling from a mix of adrenaline, awe, and exhaustion. The streets of Rome were beginning to stir, vendors calling out, carts rattling over cobblestones, and the distant chatter of early risers. Yet none of it seemed real after what they had just witnessed. The sacred flame, the Vestal, the Guardians, the world they had stepped into inside those walls felt almost removed from time itself, a layer beneath the Rome everyone else knew. Lucia exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her forehead. I can't believe any of that was real. The fire, the Guardians, the Vestal herself, alive all this time." Elias nodded, still clutching the glass flame carefully. "It's more than real. It's history preserved, secrets that survived centuries because someone or something protected them. The Vestals weren't just symbolic. They were the living memory of Rome. And now we've seen it." Lucia looked around, hesitant. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Elias gave a rueful smile. "Maybe not yet. But someday, when people are ready for the truth, they'll understand. We have to make sure it's preserved carefully, safely. That's our responsibility now." They walked slowly through the winding streets, keeping to quieter alleys to avoid attention. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that, even though the Guardians had allowed them to leave, they weren't entirely finished observing. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see shadows moving behind the stone walls or a flicker of movement in a window above. But nothing appeared, only the quiet morning bustle of the city. Once they reached a small cafe tucked into a narrow street, They sat down at a corner table, letting themselves breathe for the first time. Elias placed the glass flame gently on the table, turning it slowly in his hands. The sunlight caught it and sent tiny reflections dancing across the walls. It felt alive in a way nothing else had. Almost breathing, almost sentient. Lucia stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. Do you think there were others? More Vestals who survived like her? Hidden like that? Elias considered it. It's possible. If one was preserved, one was chosen for a reason. Perhaps the fire only reveals the guardian it trusts most. But maybe there are others. Maybe this is just one chapter of a much larger story we haven't uncovered yet. Lucia nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. And the guardians, the shadows, they weren't trying to harm us. They were testing us. But what happens if someone else comes looking who doesn't understand the story, who doesn't have good intentions? Elias's grip on the glass flame tightened. Then they might trigger consequences we can't predict. The fire remembers everything, and some parts of its memory are dangerous. That's why the Vestal warned us. Not all memories are meant to be shared. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the enormity of what they had experienced sink in. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the hidden history that had just revealed itself to them. And yet, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. Not really. The Vestal's warning, the words on the parchment, the faint trace of another figure still hiding, it lingered in the back of his mind like an ember ready to ignite. Lucia leaned forward, her voice low. What about Marcia? We have to tell her we're safe, and that we've found the truth. Elias hesitated. We should, but carefully. Whoever has been sending warnings, whoever has been watching, we can't risk revealing too much too soon. Marcia's safety is just as important as the story itself. Lucia nodded reluctantly, and they made a plan to meet her later, discreetly. As they left the cafe, Elias kept the flame protected in a small cloth bag, hidden against his chest. Each step through the crowded streets of Rome felt surreal. They had been part of something centuries in the making, a secret preserved against time, politics, and human curiosity. And yet, for all the revelation, Elias couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was still waiting, still guarding, still watching. Hours later, when they finally reunited with Marcia in a quiet library, her relief was palpable. She barely noticed the careful glances they cast around the room before leaning in. "You're safe," she breathed. "You actually saw it." Elias nodded, showing her the glass flame wrapped carefully in the cloth. Marcia's hands trembled slightly as she touched it, reverent and cautious at once. "I've always known the truth existed, but I never imagined we would find her. The missing Vestal, the fire, it's all real." Lucia spoke next. She warned us. The fire remembers everything, and it tests anyone who seeks the truth. Only those who are ready, those with the right intent, can witness it safely. Marcia's eyes widened. "You saw the Guardians?" Elias nodded. "They're real. Not enemies. Protectors. They ensured we reached the right point, that we were worthy." Marcia sank into a chair, running her hands through her hair. "I've studied the Vestals for decades, yet I never felt the weight of what they truly protected. We thought the sacred fire was ceremonial, symbolic, but it's alive, and it has memory. It carries history in a way we can barely comprehend." Elias leaned forward, urgency in his voice. "We need to document this carefully. Not just the artifacts, the flame, or the chamber, but everything. The stories, the warnings, the guardians, the missing Vestal. It's a responsibility now. We can't let this history be lost again." Marcia nodded slowly. "Yes, but we must tread carefully. Not everyone can handle the truth. Some parts of the fire's memory are dangerous if misused." Lucia glanced down at the glass flame. "I thought once we saw it, the danger was over. But it feels like it's still alive, still watching." Elias didn't respond immediately. He realized she was right. The fire, the Vestal, the Guardians, they had tested them, guided them, and allowed them to leave with knowledge. But the fire didn't forget. And in some subtle way, it wasn't finished. As the afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, casting long, warm beams across the floor, Elias finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. The missing Vestal story was uncovered. The sacred flame's secret preserved. The shadows, the guardians, the tests, they had survived and proven their worth. Yet, just as relief began to settle in, Marcia handed Elias a folded piece of parchment she had kept hidden until now. He unfolded it carefully. It was written in the same delicate script as the one they had found in the temple. At first, it seemed mundane historical notes, scribbled observations. But then he noticed the final line, written almost as an afterthought. Not all who are remembered wish to be found. One remains, watching the watchers. Elias and Lucia exchanged a long, tense glance. Marcia's expression darkened. I never thought I'd see it. Even after all these years, someone else has remained hidden. The story isn't fully finished. There's one more secret that has not yet revealed itself. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. So, even now, someone or something is still guarding the Vestal's secrets. Still waiting. Yes, Marcia whispered. And when the time is right, it will act again. For the first time, the weight of their discovery felt heavier, almost suffocating. They had resolved centuries-old mysteries, witnessed the power of the sacred fire, and survived the tests of its guardians. But the final warning made it clear. The story was not truly over. The hidden Vestal, the fire, the guardians, they were patient, eternal, and waiting for the moment history demanded their intervention again. As Elias carefully rewrapped the glass flame, he realized that the mystery of the Vestals, the sacred fire, and the hidden truths of Rome would follow them forever. And the thought that someone, or something, was still watching lingered like a shadow over their every step. They had uncovered the secret, but the final chapter, the last hidden guardian, remained just out of reach. And deep down, they knew that the next revelation could change everything once more. Because in Rome, history never truly sleeps. And somewhere in the shadows, waiting silently, the last Vestal's memory remained alive. Watching, judging, ready. The city around them hummed with life, ordinary and oblivious to the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. Elias and Lucia walked slowly through the narrow streets, the weight of the glass flame wrapped safely in its cloth resting against Elias's chest. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the stones, casting familiar shadows that now felt oddly comforting after the tension of the hidden chamber. Rome had always been layered with history, but now they knew that beneath the visible city lay another world entirely, one guarded by time, memory, and the unwavering dedication of the Vestals. Lucia broke the silence first. Do you think anyone else will ever see the flame, the fire, the guardians? Elias shook his head. I think it's meant to be rare. Only those ready, those who can truly understand, are allowed to witness it. The fire remembers everything, yes, but it chooses carefully who sees its full truth. He glanced around at the streets, bustling with life. Most people live their whole lives in Rome without ever seeing what we've seen. And maybe that's for the best. They turned into a quiet piazza, and Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe deeply. The flame they had witnessed, the Vestal who had survived hidden for centuries, the guardians who had tested them, they'd all taught him something beyond history or archaeology. It was about patience, about responsibility, and about respect for knowledge that carries power. Some secrets were not meant for casual discovery. They required understanding, careful thought, and reverence. Lucia reached out and lightly touched his arm. Do you think we'll be able to tell the story in a way that people will believe, that will honor what we've seen? Elias nodded slowly. We have to, but we also have to be careful. This isn't just a story about a missing Vestal or a hidden flame. It's about memory, preservation, and respect for the past. If we tell it carelessly, we could lose the lesson it carries. They made their way to Marcia's apartment, where she was waiting quietly, her eyes lighting up with relief when she saw them. The trio sat together, the city noise outside fading in a background as they recounted every detail they could safely share. The discovery of the hidden chamber, the glass flame, the message of the fire remembering, and the presence of the guardians. Every word was weighed carefully, mindful of the warnings they had received. Marcia listened intently, nodding at the appropriate moments, but she also added context that made everything clearer. The Vestals were not just priestesses. They were living symbols of Rome's continuity, protectors of a sacred flame that symbolized life, vigilance, and memory. What you saw, what you experienced, is the essence of that duty. And the guardians, they are extensions of the flame itself, bound to protect what must endure. Lucia's eyes widened. So, the fire, it's not just symbolic. It's alive in a way. Marcia nodded. Yes, and it carries responsibility. That's why you were tested. Not to frighten you, but to ensure you understood what it means to carry a story like this. Elias let the weight of her words settle. The mystery had been solved, the Vestal found, and the flame understood. Yet he knew the lessons went beyond the chamber and the artifacts. They applied to how people respect history itself, how knowledge is treated, and how fragile truth can be when hidden or ignored. As the afternoon light shifted through the apartment windows, they discussed their next steps carefully. The flame would need to be kept safe, documented with the utmost care, and the story written in a way that balanced truth with the caution demanded by the Guardian's warnings. Marcia suggested creating a detailed record of their journey, the symbols they encountered, the parchment messages, and the fire's behavior. They would preserve a narrative for future scholars while ensuring that the deeper secrets of the flame were not exploited. Lucia looked at the flame one more time, feeling a sense of quiet awe. It's strange, it feels like it's still alive, still watching. But peaceful now. Elias nodded. Yes, the test is over. We've been deemed worthy. The fire remembers us as protectors, not intruders. That's why we were allowed to leave with it. Marcia added, and that's the lesson. History, memory, and knowledge have guardians. Not everything is meant for immediate understanding. Sometimes the past waits for the right person to arrive, the right time to act. That's the real power of the Vestals and their sacred duty. They spent the next hours carefully documenting everything, cross-referencing historical records, and preserving notes about the Vestal, the chamber, and the fire. Every detail was captured, yet some mysteries remained intentionally vague, safeguarded in respect for the warnings that had been given. They knew some elements were meant to remain secret until a time when the world was ready to understand them fully. As the day turned to evening, Elias, Lucia, and Marcia stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Rome began to twinkle, and the shadows of ancient structures stretched long across the streets. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary again, but the memory of what they had witnessed lingered. The flame, the Vestal, and the Guardians had left a permanent mark on them. Lucia broke the quiet. Do you think she's still watching? Elias smiled faintly, a mixture of reverence and certainty in his expression. Yes, and that's a comfort, in a way. It means the history we've seen isn't just a story, it's living, and we've been entrusted to honor it. Marcia nodded, her eyes reflecting the city lights. History isn't only about what happened. It's about how we remember, how we respect, and how we carry it forward. The Vestal survived because they understood that. Now so do you. As the three stood in quiet reflection, Elias allowed himself to feel a sense of closure. The missing Vestal had been found. The sacred flame's secret had been revealed and preserved. The shadows, the tests, and the Guardians had all been part of a larger, timeless system ensuring that history's most sacred truths were protected. The danger had passed, but the lessons remained clear, permanent, and profound. And yet, even in their sense of resolution, a small, quiet tension lingered. The final note on the parchment, the hidden Guardian still watching, reminded them that history, like the fire, was patient. The past could wait centuries for the right eyes to see it and the right hearts to carry it forward. Elias realized that this awareness, this respect for the weight of memory, was the true gift of the Vestal story. As night settled over Rome, the city glimmered under a sky full of stars, and the trio felt an unusual calm. They had completed their journey, discovered truths that had been hidden for centuries, and preserved them with care. But most importantly, they understood what it meant to bear witness responsibly, to protect knowledge, and to honor those who had kept it safe through the ages. The story of the Vestal Virgins, the sacred flame, and the hidden guardians would endure, not just in their writings, but in the understanding and reverence they now carried. It was a story of patience, courage, and respect for the past, a reminder that some secrets are protected for a reason, and some histories are alive in ways most people can never see. Elias looked down at the glass flame one final time, careful in his hands. It seemed to pulse softly, almost as if it recognized their efforts, their respect, and their understanding. Lucia and Marcia stood beside him, sharing the quiet reverence, knowing that they had become part of a story much larger than themselves, a story that spanned centuries, that had survived shadows, tests, and secrecy, and that now had a future thanks to their care. They left the balcony, moving quietly back inside, the flame safe, the story preserved, and the lessons of the Vestals carried in their hearts. Outside, Rome continued its rhythm, unaware of the hidden world just beneath its surface. But for Elias, Lucia, and Marcia, the city would never feel the same again. The history they had witnessed would stay with them forever, a reminder that respect for knowledge, patience in discovery, and reverence for the past were as vital now as they had been in the days of the Vestals. And in that understanding, they found peace. The story had reached its end, but its memory would continue, alive, watchful, and eternal.